An historic challenge to Russia's Vladimir Putin ended yesterday, a day after the leader of a Russian paramilitary group turned on Russia and marched his fighters towards Moscow. Bradley Blackburn brings us the latest on the chaos that unfolded and how it came to an end.
The leader of the Wagner paramilitary group said his fighters were just 120 miles from Moscow when they suddenly turned around. A deal brokered by Belarus ended a rebellion by Wagner chief Evgeny Prigozhin, who wanted to overthrow Russia's military leaders. Prigozhin's mercenary group has fought fiercely for Russia in Ukraine, but an internal rift has been growing. Anger over a lack of supplies and claims that a Russian airstrike targeted a Wagner camp. On state TV, Russian President Vladimir Putin said Prigozhin was a traitor and vowed punishment. The deal means he will now live in exile, and Russia says charges will be dropped. It was an historic challenge to Putin. Wagner took control of a key military facility in the Russian city Rostov-on-Don, then moved toward the capital. And Russian troops scrambled to defend Moscow. Crews even dug up highways attempting to slow the march with makeshift roadblocks. It ends without bloodshed, but there are questions about what it means for Putin's power. The divide clearly visible. Overnight in Rostov-on-Don, crowds of locals were cheering for Wagner mercenaries as they drove out of the city. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky said it showed Putin's weakness. Today, the world saw that the bosses of Russia do not control anything, nothing at all, he said. Wagner troops have been ordered to return to their camps in Ukraine. Bradley Blackburn, CBS News, New York.
President Biden and other world leaders were monitoring the situation closely and speaking by phone. Instability in Russia raises concerns about what it means for the country's massive nuclear arsenal. There are a lot of questions about what exactly is happening in Russia after those tense hours yesterday when that armed mercenary group was marching on Moscow. Our friend Professor David Schultz of Hamline University has lived and taught in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus in recent years. He spent yesterday contacting friends and colleagues in those countries. I spoke to Professor Schultz about the uprising a short time ago. Take a look. Well, joining us now is Professor David Schultz. Thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me again.
I know you've been telling me that you've been in communication with your friends and colleagues in Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. What are they saying?
Well, first off, it was interesting that when I contacted first friends in Moscow, they were worried, anxious. They didn't know what was going on either. And some of them asked me, said, well, what perspective are you getting from the West? What are you hearing? And so there was a blackout on knowledge there. Okay. And again, just a concern that they did not know what was going on. But what struck me the most, and again, I've taught in Belarus, I've taught in Moscow, Russia, I've taught in Ukraine, is the very different perspectives also in terms of Prigozhin. That in Russia and in Belarus, he was viewed as a criminal, as a traitor, versus in Ukraine and perhaps in the United States, viewed maybe not as a criminal, maybe as the person who's going to oust Putin, but very different perspectives.
All right. Although he is no saint, as we were talking
Correct.
Before. I mean, this
Correct.
is somebody who was accused of atrocities when he was fighting with the Russians against the Ukrainians not so long ago. Let me ask you, is this over? And Prigozhin is now reportedly going to go into exile in Belarus, where you said he's viewed as a criminal. I mean, what about his future?
Well, I don't think it's over at this point, clearly, that this is kind of an uneasy truce between the two of them to diffuse a short-term situation. If I'm Putin, I'm still worried about the fact that this was a pretty serious challenge to his regime. For Prigozhin, Belarus is more or less a satellite country of Russia. If I were him, I would be worried about my personal security and safety. Additionally, the Wagner group, which is the mercenary group of Prigozhin's that's been fighting along with Russia, we don't quite know what their status is.
Right.
So there's a lot we just don't know at this point in terms of what's happening. We also don't know why the deal was cut. Okay. Although my friends in Ukraine say, I think Prigozhin basically realized that he can't oust the Russian military with 25,000 troops.
Although we were just seeing some images that showed him being cheered, he and his forces being cheered as they came over and came through several southern cities, taking command of two larger cities. One of the things that Zelensky, President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine, is saying is, and a lot of people here are apparently agreeing, is that this has definitely left Vladimir Putin weakened. Do you agree with that?
He's definitely weakened at this point because it shows really sort of the cracks in his authoritarian rule after nearly after nearly 2 decades at this point. And the fact that somebody, one of his loyal lieutenants at one point, was challenging the way he was. I mean, it's a precarious situation. The news that I'm also hearing today is that, and I don't know how accurate it is that Putin is not in Moscow, going to a safe location. I'm hearing, again, how much this is true, I don't know.
Well, there have been numerous news reports about that to that effect as well.
Yeah.
That he fled the capital.
Yeah, I think they're all scared about what's going to happen next, and I think that's true. In some sense, I would view what's happened right now as a temporary pause in this internal civil war, and that Prigozhin and maybe others are going to be now regrouping. And that's what I'm worried about if I'm Putin at this point, is to say that is there now others who might be plotting? Okay. And so now he's got this fear with his subordinates that's probably just going to keep undermining or being in the back of his brain.
And if you're Prigozhin, are you really thinking that you're safe in Belarus from Vladimir Putin?
No, I would not think that whatsoever at this point. That's why I find it an incredibly odd deal. Now, he can't go anywhere else in the world because there's warrants for him also at this point. That's why I'm a little perplexed by it, because literally as the deal was coming down, I was talking to a friend of mine who I taught with, in Kiev, and we were trying to speculate on why. Okay. I think at best this is a temporary truce.
Okay. Well, we will all be watching. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor David Schultz, as always.
My pleasure. Thank you.